I welcome disputation, disagreement, questions, Bible verses. I brought a Bible along. In some cases I know the text well, some I can look them up, some I can get back to you on. Questions, comments, complaints, ideas, new things, whatever. Wide open. Who would like to be? This will be like a Billy Graham meeting. Once one or two hands go up, see, then others will join in. Oh, thank you for that hand, sister.
So, what's your suggestion for the, I have 26 and 23 and 17-year-olds. Church can often turn them off and turn them away from God. So what would you suggest?
Oh my goodness. That yourself would take up the rest of our time. Have you considered alternatives other than church?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, I'm just trying to pose a question for the
Well,
viewers.
in my opinion, my brother-in-law is a Jain from India. And among the most brilliant people I've known. And it's been my privilege in being a college administrator, professor, seminary, be around a lot of brilliant people. He's among the most brilliant, period. And his name is Jain, that's how Jain he is. So he's very far removed from the Christian tradition. My suggestion, whether it's young people, old people, people like me that are pretty old, you got to spend a bunch of quality time among quality people. And you may find them in some churches, and you may not. You may find them among secularists, and you may not. You may find them among the literati, and you may find them among architects, and you may find them among mechanics. And you have to find quality people in whom to. But I would inherently distrust any system which claims this enormous allegiance to the one whom they constantly violate at nearly every turn. That would concern me greatly. I'm not a parent, I do not have children, and I do not really have a religious type influence, say, on my nephews, of whom I have 5. But if you're asking me, I would probably be inclined to explore dialogue, to ask questions. I would certainly not avoid Jesus. I would study the Gospels, but I would not study them to the exclusion of other things. And I would suggest that you and your children, or spouse, or other family members, if there are other people involved, that you spend quality time with quality people. It's one of the wonderful things about life. And I advise you to never move to my state of Mississippi. Amen.
You're from Mississippi?
Pardon me?
You're from Mississippi?
Tallahatchie County, not just Mississippi.
Oh my God.
The home of the Tallahatchie Bridge. Yes.
We just learned about that bridge.
You did what? You've crossed the bridge, or?
I learned about it in my history class.
Oh yeah,
yesterday.
yeah. It became the big song of, I think it was 1967.
Yeah.
Yeah. By the way, for those of you interested in the civil rights movement, the most important early civil rights case in Mississippi is the Emmett Till case of 1955. You should really study that. It's a terrible travesty of so-called justice in America. It took place in my county of Tallahatchie County, the death of Emmett Till. Some of you may. There's a fine little book. It's out of print, but it's out there at Amazon and Best Buy Books and whatever, called A Death in the Delta. It really tells the Emmett Till story very well. That's a whole separate thing. Yeah, so around quality people. Yes? Christian, generally rather fundamental. In my younger days, more of the beatings I took in life were not for, stealing things or whatever, but for asking questions that sounded blasphemous. For example, now here's a terrible one. I was taught, and this is in the 60s now, I was taught, and many people could tell you they had a similar experience. We were taught that black people did not have souls. Black people were not really human like white people were, so blacks don't have souls. And I confronted the pastor. Now, I was only about 11, but I said, then that's really to their advantage, because every Sunday you say most people are going to go to hell and burn forever, so hell will have no black people in it. Only white people are going to hell. And I got in trouble, and then I got several layers of trouble after that. Dr. Marion.
Since you bring that up, it does make me wonder, You talk about shift from law to love. But is it not Jesus that first introduces the concept of hell in the scriptures?
No.
No. Where does it first show up?
That's a good point. It actually shows up, it comes to the Jewish tradition through the Zoroastrian Persian stuff. But it comes late. It shows up quite late. But yes, it is an interesting thing that Jesus does talk about Gehenna. I should tell you that in the New Testament there are two different words that are translated hell. They don't anywhere mean nearly the same thing. Hades, as in the god of the underworld, Hades is simply the place of the dead. And that's because in Jesus' teaching, the dead are dead. That's one of the reasons we have to know that the rich man and Lazarus is a parable, because Jesus is constantly saying the dead are asleep, the dead don't know anything, the dead will wake up on the resurrection day, which was the rather traditional Jewish view. When he says in Matthew, for example, I will build my ecclesia, my church, which never means building, it means a group of people, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. The word there is Hades, suggesting that his movement will not die out. That's really what it is. But then there's a second word, Gehenna, and that's the word, that's the problem hell of torment and punishment. And yes, that is found in Jesus on a few occasions. It's found in Matthew. I don't know whether he says it or not in Mark. Probably. There are scant references to it. But in the New Testament itself, the first one actually is John the Baptist who preaches it. The fire unquenchable. But Jesus himself does find it. But you find parallels late in the Old Testament. It's a fine question. The Old Testament idea of a tormenting in hell doesn't come around until probably the late portions of the book of Isaiah. Now, this is a separate issue, but scholarship today rarely believes that one Isaiah wrote those full 66 chapters. That 40 through 66 were written by Deutero-Isaiah, which is post-Persian. If that's the case, then everything you find in the Old Testament hinting toward a tormenting hell, which is Gehenna, not Hades, comes after their experience with the Persians. That's probably why the Pharisees, remember in Hebrew is written in consonants, usually triconsonantal. So the word for Pharisee in Hebrew is Pe-resh shin, P-R-S, which in Hebrew is the verb meaning parash, to separate. And the Pharisees call themselves the separated one, which essentially is bragging about your holiness. But the Sadducees said, no. Pe-resh shin means P-R-S like Persia. You guys are the Persianizers with all your late doctrines. Angels and judgment and demons and afterlife, none of which the Sadducees held to. So it's a late thing, but it's there, and I think that we can either credit or discredit Jesus as being the product of his times in that regard. Today you would find some churches, for example, that would say, yeah, Jesus really was right when he talked about people demon-possessed, but you'd find a great number of others who say, well, we know people aren't really possessed by demons, they have mental illness, they have schizophrenia, they have epileptic seizures, or whatever. So it goes with a lot of the other things. It's difficult to separate Jesus from his worldview in many ways. Nonetheless, it should be noted that there are a couple times, not too many, but there are a couple times when Jesus does give the warnings that if you don't see things my way, you could be in some pretty big trouble in a painful and tormenting sort of way. I think those things, by the way, in my estimation as a New Testament scholar, I think they do come from Jesus because each of the three synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, each one preserves exactly one apocalyptic chapter. It's Mark 13, Luke 21, Matthew 24. And chronologically, they all fit at the same point in the flow of events. John doesn't have an apocalyptic chapter, but here's a statistic you probably aren't familiar with. When you read the Gospel of John, 92% of what you read in John is not told in any other of the three Gospels. Only 8% of John overlaps the synoptics. So it shouldn't surprise us that there's all kinds of stuff in John that you don't read elsewhere. In fact, in the synoptics, all Jesus ever talks about is the kingdom of God, and in John it's only mentioned in chapter 18 and not in the other 20 chapters of the Gospel. So John is such a maverick, distinctive work. Matthew, for this, if you're interested in the statistics, if you read Mark's Gospel, 90% of what Mark writes is repeated elsewhere in Matthew or Luke or John. 70% of Matthew is repeated in one of the other Gospels. 60% of Luke is repeated, but only 8% of John overlaps. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke each have an apocalyptic chapter. In the apocalyptic chapter, it's the things like the cosmic signs, the moon turned to blood, the wars and rumors of wars, and famine and pestilence and calamities of all sorts. And that is there. I am not well, there's a lot of things. I could make a long list of what I don't believe. But in New Testament scholarship, I am very opposed to the idea of the eternal and conscious torment of the condemned. I think in the New Testament itself, you find words like destruction, annihilation, be as though they have never been. That's because, as we know from philosophy, the idea of the inherent immortal soul comes to us from Plato, who is after the time of the Old Testament, but before the time of the New Testament. Plato comes in there in that interim period when the Old Testament is finished up, but the New has not yet begun. The New Testament does not speak of an immortal soul. It speaks of the potential of immortality, but it does not assume immortality. And the Old Testament says things like the soul shall die, the soul that sins shall die. Paul says in Romans the wages of sin is death. Paul never says the wages of sin is torment. He says the wages of sin is death. You die because of sin, but he doesn't say you get tormented because of it. But there are a handful of passages that Jesus does say this. If you retreat to my position and say, hey, the guy was good, but he wasn't perfect, it's pretty easy to deal with. But if you find yourself and you choose to put yourself, no one makes you do this, if you choose to put yourself in the position of defending every word and every inch and every verse, I assure you, you'll have a tall order, just in the conversations you and I could have. But if you'll take on the whole world and hang out a sign that says, you know, and I've confronted many of these evangelists and pastors over the years that wave the Bible and say there's no mistake, there's no contradiction, it's all perfect. And then I pin them down, and eventually it's, well, you got to have faith. It's not the solution. Tyson, question?
Yeah, I mean, this might come back to that, but how do you reconcile this paradigm shift when Jesus himself says, whatever, I do not come to overturn the old...
Yeah, that's a great passage, and one which people retreat to. I think I have a solution for that. He says, think not that I am come to destroy the law and prophets, but that I've come to fulfill them. I think that's probably the passage you're getting to. To say, think that I've come not to destroy the law and prophets is sort of a pretty way of saying, well, I'm not just throwing them out the window. But the second half of that is the clause that says, but I've come to fulfill them. It's teleo in Greek, the idea of to bring to completion, teleology, a goal. And it seems to me that Jesus is saying, you've missed it. With all this focus on the idiosyncrasies of the law and the prophets, I'm not blanket wiping them out, but I'm bringing them to their completion, to their designed end, to the teleological point at which they should arrive, which would be, in Jesus' idea, the great commandment of loving God supremely and loving everyone else. And that fulfills the law and prophets. It doesn't destroy them in the sense that it demeans them. But when he says that I'm come to fulfill them, fulfilled is not, in my opinion, the best translation. It's teleos in Greek, teleo. Finish is a better word. When he hangs on the cross, he says in John, it is finished, tetelestai. It's the perfect present of teleo. So teleo is finished, and I think what he's saying in the Gospels is, I didn't come to casually dismiss the law and the prophets. I've come to bring them to their completion. The whole system ends with Jesus, in my view. Now, here's another thing that I have a dispute with people. We've talked about the Ten Commandments being on display in Mount Vernon, which to me is violatory on 6 or 7 different reasons. Not the least of which is it should be the last thing that religious people who claim Christianity are purporting. The great hero Paul, who is a fascinating study in his own, and frankly a whole series of headaches, but Paul himself says that law was only given to a certain group of people, Jews, for a certain period of time.